I'm going to just do a really brief introduction while people kind of trickle in into our Zoom call. I want to thank you all for coming today. If you didn't know, you're in our Master Gardeners Q&A, and today's topic is composting. So joining us today is our Greene County Master Gardener, Mark Bernskoetter. He's ready to answer all of our composting conundrums. My name is Katie Hopkins. I'm the Adult Programming Coordinator with the Springfield-Greene County Library District. I'm your host this morning. I'm just kind of in the background monitoring the chat. And you can, ping me in the chat if you're having issues with Zoom. Just some friendly Zoom reminders, because I feel like we're all still getting comfortable with it, even all these months later. Whether you're on a laptop, a phone, a tablet, there should be buttons at the bottom of your screen to toggle your video on and off, as well as your microphone. So obviously we'd ask that you keep your microphone muted while Mark is speaking, but be sure to unmute yourself when it's your turn to ask a question. Same with your video. It's obviously up to you whether to keep that on or off, but we encourage you to leave it on. I feel like that just helps it feel a little more natural, even though we're all still in a computer world. So that is an option to you as well. So you can use your chat feature to ask questions. Some people are more comfortable typing it in than speaking, and I will certainly try to make sure that I field those questions to Mark after he's going to do a presentation at the beginning. And lastly, your screen somewhere on it, usually at the top, but it varies, has an option to toggle between speaker view and gallery view. And I always explain that to people because speaker view will enlarge and highlight the person who is speaking, whereas gallery view is Brady Bunch style. You're going to see everybody at once. So some people have one preference or the other, especially if they're on a smaller screen. To hear about other upcoming library programs, please be sure to visit our website or pick up a copy of Bookends at your favorite branch. I'm going to drop links to our upcoming programs in the chat, and I'm going to hand things over to Mark now.
All right. Well, thanks, Katie. So just wanted to wish everyone a good morning. And what we're going to talk about this morning is composting. Interestingly enough, I attended a conference, a gardening conference. Yes, they really do have conferences about gardening. And there was a speaker, like the keynote speaker, somebody that at that time was kind of famous in some of the circles of gardening and stuff around the country even. And even in some other countries, he had done a lot of work. And he was supposed to be talking to us about composting. And what he did was he got up in front of this audience of about, 250 people or so. And he said, all right, we're going to talk about composting. And he said, here's the rule: pile it up and let it rot. Do you have any questions? And of course, after that, he actually presented more information. However, he was, being rather tongue-in-cheek, I guess, trying to be humorous as far as it is pretty simple to compost materials. Now, there are different ways to compost things, and some ways are better than others. And I do have a little presentation that I'm going to do here, so bear with me just a moment as I switch over. And we're going to go to, all right, hopefully you can see my composting presentation being pulled up here. Let me know if it's not showing. So the whole idea of composting is that you're going to be able to do something with a lot of your food scraps that, and plant matter and things like that. You're going to be able to do something with them other than throw them in the garbage. You can turn them back into a rich organic soil additive called compost. And here's a list of reasons for composting. One of the biggest, I think, is saving all of these scraps that would otherwise go to the landfill. And I do have some statistics on that here in just a moment. But there's nutrients there, the effect that it has on your soil. If you have a clay soil, adding compost to it helps loosen it up. There's actually a lot of nutrition in clay soil, but our plants can't usually get to it. The roots can't find the nutrients in clay because the clay is so solid and it's hard for the roots to permeate everywhere. So adding compost to a clay soil actually enriches it, it loosens it up, and then it also frees up all of the minerals that are naturally existing in clay soil. It does a lot of other things listed here too, but I wanted to focus on the last one on this slide. Just for the environment, a head of lettuce takes 25 years to decompose in a landfill. But that same head of lettuce, if you throw it in your compost pile, it only takes it about 2 to 3 weeks to decompose into compost. So when you look at that, that is just a phenomenal difference. And this, you can apply these same sorts of things to anything from your banana peels or apple, parts of vegetables or fruits that are leftovers, or plant matter that you've cleared out of a garden, all of that sort of stuff. If you throw it in a landfill, it lasts for a long, long, long time. But if you can throw it into a compost pile, it'll decompose much, much faster, and it'll give you something that's very worthwhile. Statistics also show that here in the US, about half of the trash that gets put out at the curb for pickup is actually compostable. So some pretty big statistics, I think, about environmental impact and why we would want to compost. Excuse me. So I want to get a little bit into the basic elements that are required in composting. Across the top, we have 3 things listed. Brown matter and green matter will yield compost. Now, it has to have interaction by a couple other things that you can also control. So brown matter, let's start with that. Brown matter, for the most part, are things that would usually be considered, or that are usually brown. Leaves, dried leaves, straw, things of that sort. A plant material that has dried up, and so it's probably brown. Green matter are those things that are still green, like fresh grass clippings or food scraps. Now, even like banana peels or apple peels or something like that, if you have some of that or an apple core, those are still considered green because they are fresher. They still have the signs of life in them. They're not all dried out like the brown matter. And when you add those two together and mix in 2 other things, water and air, those are on the next line down. You need the right amount of moisture in order to keep the chemical reaction going between the brown and green matter. Too much water, and it kind of extinguishes, it puts out that chemical reaction. Not enough water, and there isn't enough for the chemical reaction to continue. So you need the right amounts of water. Then you also need air. It actually needs to be turned over. A compost pile needs to be turned over a little bit, needs to, stick a pitchfork in there or something and kind of mix it up a little bit. By doing that, it actually lets a little bit of air into that compost pile. And that air is going to be really important because the air is what makes the difference of whether this is a smelly, stinky mess because there's not enough air in it, or if it's a nice kind of an earthy smell. Smells kind of like soil typically does. It's not a real strong odor or anything like that. Compost shouldn't stink. It should just smell kind of like soil. And that means that you have a good reaction going in there and a good mix of these basic things. So you got the brown matter, the green matter, the water, and the air. Those are the four things that you really control. Now, down across the bottom of this little screen, it gives you a couple other things. There are what are called macroorganisms. Those are things you can see, and like the earthworms, other insects, even like roly-polies, and things of that sort. Those organisms are in there helping to break down all of that material. You also have what are called microorganisms. Some of those, even like you may see at times a bloom of a mushroom or a fungus of some sort in your compost pile. Usually that's a good sign. And when you go to turn over your compost pile, if you see some white webbing like stuff, it's not like spider webs, it's thicker than that. But it's kind of a webbing look. It's just these tendrils of white in your compost. That fungus is actually very good in your compost pile. It does a lot in your compost pile and breaks things down very nicely. So just because you see some, fungus growing in there, some, mushrooms or something, it's probably not mushrooms that you'll want to eat. There's only very few mushrooms that are edible. Most are not, and they will make you sick, if not, even worse than that. But you're not, in your compost pile, those kinds of things do wonders. They do a lot for helping to break down all that matter. Now, I've got a list here, and I'm not going to go through it. And when we can come back to it later, there's also going to be a handout that Katie will be sending out to you that will have information like this. It'll have these lists. These are some examples of carbons and nitrogens that you can throw into your compost pile. Or it also gives you some disclaimers about some things. For example, if we look on the left side of the screen, the carbons, those are brown matters. As we look down the list, you see sawdust is listed there. Now, sawdust is very, very high carbon, so it would need a lot of nitrogen to go with it. Straw, it lists here, but it mentions straw, not hay. Hay usually will have a lot of seed in it. It's also greener. Hay is usually not. It just depends on what point, at what point you purchase it or you acquire it or put it in or whatever. But typically hay is not, it's not all brown. It has a lot of green in it, or it has a lot of seed in it, things like that. Wood chips or bark, but I wouldn't suggest putting a lot of those. And then it just lists a bunch of other things. And I'm going to skip way down to the wood ashes. That's a question that people a lot of times ask. And if you have some wood ash, it's okay in small amounts to add that to your compost pile. And that is considered a carbon. It really doesn't add much as far as, nutrition or anything like that. But it is a way that you can dispose of some wood ashes from time to time. But it does mention there not charcoal ash. So like out of a barbecue grill or something like that, if you've got charcoal that you were using, that is not good. Not that it's bad, but charcoal ash has no nutritional value. Charcoal ash, it has been burned so many times that every bit of nutrition's burned out of it. So it's not something that is of value in a compost pile at all. Then on the nitrogen side, those are the things that are listed also as green matter, although not always green. And it's got all different kinds of things listed in there. And you can see some of those. The trick to any of this is to get a good combination of the carbon and the nitrogen. And we can talk a little bit more about some of that later. And in the handout, it goes into a little more of that information about, kind of ratios of some of the things that you might want to consider. Oops, I think it skipped over one. One thing that you don't probably want to do, unless you have a really, if you're going to spend a lot of time taking care of your compost pile and work on it at least every 2 days, and turn it over and keep the right amount of moisture and monitor the temperature and do a lot of things with it. If you want to do all of that much work, you could put diseased plant matter in there, and the composting process will kill the diseases. However, most of us don't spend that much time on our compost pile. I'm included in that. And therefore, I try not to put diseased plant matter into my compost pile. That I dispose of another way. So, whether that's piling it up maybe to burn or something along those lines. I don't compost diseased plant matter. So this is kind of the optimal. This is the hot composting. Not many people want to spend this much time and effort to do all of this stuff. And the handout will go into these details as well. So I'm not really going to go into them, but you can just see, just by the sheer number of words on this screen and the number of steps that are listed, there's a lot of things to do for a hot composting. And remember, hot composting, that's the one that would break down and kill those like plant diseases or pests that might have gotten onto your plants. It would actually kill a lot of that stuff because the temperature gets up pretty high in there. It gets up to like 160 degrees. And so when you see a compost pile that is kind of misting a little bit, it's giving off moisture and you can see it coming up out of the pile, it's steaming. That's because it has reached that temperature. Now, for true hot composting, you keep it that way for a couple weeks, that you need to keep it at that level so that it actually kills all of that stuff. And that means to keep it at that level consistently for those 2 weeks. So that's hard to do on our own. You can see how many steps are here. Now we're going to look at what we call cold composting, which is 2 steps. Pile it up and let it rot, just like that speaker had said at a meeting that I had been to once. You can see it's a lot simpler. All you're doing is piling it up. And then I go out, every month or two, and I may turn the pile. I'm not out there on a daily or weekly basis doing any of that. For the most part, I just keep piling things into it. Much easier process, but it does not kill those plant diseases, any pests, if there were any eggs laid on, or other pests had gotten on your plants. It doesn't kill any of that sort of thing. So that's kind of the downside to the cold composting, but it's so much easier. So if you just don't put those things in there to begin with, you'll be good. Here are just some examples of some different methods of composting. The one at the top left that shows the hand with the little hand rake there, they actually dug a trench in the soil and they pile their compost in there. And when it gets full enough, they start covering it up with soil. And that works really well as long as you're not going to plant there for like this season. You'll want to wait until next year or maybe in the fall. If you're doing it now, you could do this now and then in the fall, plant in that location. Because by then, this stuff will have all broken down and it will be compost and it'll already be mixed in with your soil and everything will be good. So that process works for some folks, but not everybody is able to leave a hole or a little trench in their yard and keep adding compost to it every couple days. To the right at the top is a layered sort of composting, where these folks put down compost, then they put down some brown matter, and then they maybe cover it over with like a mulch of leaves or something else that they have kind of mulched up. You could use wood chips over the top, but that's usually not as good of a thing because it takes a long time for wood to decompose. And then what happens here is, again, you don't plant in this now. You wait a few months before you plant here. But by that time, again, all of the stuff that you had put in there will have all broken down, and you'll have compost laying right there on top of the soil. And to some extent, some of the compost and soil will have intermixed, as like earthworms have moved up and down through the soil and into your compost and things like that. Now you can't, each earthworm doesn't move much soil or compost back and forth, but by the time in a row like this, in a 10-foot row, you will have thousands of earthworms working and moving back and forth, and transporting bits of the soil into the compost and the compost into the soil, and actually helping to mix it for you a little bit. Down in the lower left is a compost pile that is smoldering. It is steaming. It's good and hot. And then on the lower right is just, again, kind of a look at that, at some of the layering that occurs in your pile. If you just keep adding to your pile and let it get up to about 3 to 4 foot high, what you'll find out is by the next time you have a bunch of stuff to throw in there, it'll be lower than it was the last time you looked at it. And the reason is because you get these layers in there, and you get layers of compost developing where you have the right mix of things all coming together, and they break down. And we've got several different ways you can build a composting system, whether it's like pallets, whether you do 1 bin, 2 bins, 3 bins. There's the like cattle fencing that you can use, straw bales, all kinds of different options as to how you could go about those. Oops. Go back through them once. So with the straw bales, you basically just put your compost, start building your compost pile in the middle of that. And then the straw itself adds to all of that. All right, here we go. Some people have used methods where they put it in some sort of barrel. The one on the left is a barrel that has this tube down through it with holes in it. That allows air to keep circulating all up and down through the pile as you're building it inside this big trash can. The one at the top right is a trash can where they drilled a whole bunch of holes in it to allow the aeration to occur. And then you just keep throwing your scraps and things in there. Make sure that you throw in some brown matter from time to time as well. And all of that helps. And then the last one there is a tumbler. Now, tumblers generally aren't, they're efficient at turning things and keeping it mixed. You still have to put in the right ratio of things, but also tumblers don't always allow for more moisture to easily get in there, like when it rains. So therefore, you may have to water your tumbler. Tumblers also don't allow microorganisms, earthworms, and things like that to come up from the soil and get into them because they're up off the ground. So things like that you have to consider too. Composting leaves is great. A lot of us have a lot of extra leaves in the fall and don't know what to do with them, and people burn them or cart them off to the compost site maybe, or something like that. But actually, if you pile them up and mix in some green matter, mix in some of your vegetable and fruit scraps and things like that with it, and some other green material, some of the other green or nitrogen materials that we talked about, it produces what's called leaf mold, which is a real fine, it still has a little bit of leaf structure to it, but they're real limp and dark. And this makes a great mulch on top of like potted plants. I even mix some into my potted plants, mix it into the soil in my potted plants, because a lot of people buy those little beads that when you water the plant, the beads swell up and absorb the water. Well, composted leaves, or what's called leaf mold, although it's not full of mold, leaf mold, it will hold 500 times its weight in water. So when you mix a little bit of that in with your soil in a pot, it actually acts better than those little beads that you can buy and put into your pot. So it's a great way to use your leaves that are left over. You can pile them up somewhere in your yard and mix in some green matter to help them decompose into this composted leaf material. And then there's some things as far as if your compost pile is smelly, it may be that it's too wet, or it may be that there's too much nitrogen for the amount of carbon. It may be that you've added some stuff that maybe you shouldn't have added. So those are some different issues, and it tells you on the screen some ways to fix those, but that's also in the handout that you'll be getting. So the compost pile should not smell bad. Again, it should just have kind of an earthy soil smell to it, and nothing strong. It should just be a normal kind of smell. And if the pile doesn't heat up, well, then you just have to check it and figure out what it is that you need to add to it if you want things to decompose faster. If you just pile things up and use the cold composting process, and that's all you do, I find that usually in about six months or so, a little bit longer, maybe over the winter time, but like over the summer, it's a little less. So things that I'm throwing in my compost pile now, by fall, will be ready. They'll be broken down by not doing much else other than just piling it up and trying to keep a mix of, okay, I've got some brown matter here I can throw in and some scraps. So it's not just a lot of one thing. Sometimes your compost pile may get real soggy, and you don't want that. That means there's too much water. And if there's too much water, that means there's probably not enough air, because the water has taken up the space that the air would have. And so you want that to dry out. And you may even need to throw a tarp over it if it's going to rain, if your pile's already soggy. So basically the idea is the smaller the items are, the faster they're going to break down. And that's definitely true in your compost pile. If you shred up your leaves and then pile them up, they're going to decompose much faster than if you just rake the leaves into a big pile and let them sit there. Same thing with everything else that you throw into your compost pile. If you have some carrots that are kind of going bad in your refrigerator, for example, if you actually take a few minutes to cut them up a little bit and then throw them in your compost pile, they'll break down a lot faster. And then there's other issues as well. Sometimes if you try to water your pile, it runs off. Well, that's probably because it has dried out so much on the top layer of your compost pile that it's created a barrier. So if you just use a fork and kind of, a pitchfork or something, a spade, and just kind of mix it around a little bit, that'll help. The last point on this particular slide mentions herbicides. If you spray herbicides around your garden, herbicides are chemicals that kill plants. So it's something that you would spray to kill weeds. Probably the most commonly known one is Roundup. But if you spray a herbicide on things and it kills them, if you throw those things into your compost pile, then you're putting that herbicide in there too. Now, just know that, it takes a long time for some of those chemical herbicides to break down so that they're no longer deadly or poisonous to your plants. Because if you throw a lot of plants in here that have been sprayed by the herbicide, then when you use that compost, you're actually spreading some of that herbicide into your soil and around your plants. And it may kill your plants, but it'll probably at least make them sick or not to thrive, so they don't do as well. And then here you have some different bugs that'll show up in your piles. And your bugs can tell you, insects can tell you the health of your pile. If you have roly-polies, those are actually a good sign. But up here on the right, the earwig, or if you have a lot of ants in your pile, those are usually a sign that decomposition is just taking a long time. So it's not necessarily a bad thing. It's just saying that it's taking a long time for it to decompose, which is common when you have a cold composting system. If you have plants growing in the pile, that's great, because now you got some more plants you can take out and plant somewhere or share with some friends. Or you can just kind of dig them out, cut them up a little bit, throw them right back on the pile, and now you've got some green matter there. And those will decompose. So that's kind of the real basics of composting. For the most part, if you're going to do a cold composting process, it is pretty simple. You don't have to do a whole lot with that. All right, any questions then? I think we're at that point. And I'm going to bring us back to this slide to look at, because this is one of the areas where people have a lot of questions sometimes. And then we're also right here by this slide, if you have a question on that.
And if you do have a question, just unmute your mic and ask. These are pretty informal types of conversations typically, so.
I have a quick question. I'm using a cold composting, just a garbage bin, basically. And so I just checked it now as you were talking, and it's pretty wet. And there are actually some, wouldn't call them flies, but there are maybe gnats. And so what would that tell you about the health of that pile there?
Yeah, the gnats are usually a sign that you have probably a lot of green matter and not enough brown. It could also just tell you that it's real wet. The gnats are something that normally you would have very few, if any. I mean, you'll probably always have just a little bit, but you wouldn't notice gnats in a compost pile that's good and healthy. So some things to do. You could add some brown matter. Now, we just had a lot of rain last night. If it's an open garbage container that you're using, then it had all that rain dumped on it yesterday, during the night. But probably if there's gnats in there, they've been there for a while. It could be that you have a lot of fruit scraps, and so sort of like fruit flies, that sort of thing, are being attracted to it. And you just need to kind of get to the point where you can get some more brown matter down in there, turn it over a little bit. Whether that's, if you can get like a spade or a garden fork down in there and kind of churn it up some and get some brown matter in there. Another thing that may help, a lot of times what I find that is almost a kind of magic cure for a lot of composting problems, is if you have a garden spot where you can get a shovelful or a couple shovelfuls of soil and just chop it up real good and kind of spread it kind of in a fine layer inside your pile, then that is something that would work great too.
Thank you.
You bet. Oh, one thing about your garbage bin that you have, do you have holes in the bottom?
I do. It has a lid on it. We put two kind of wooden stakes wooden slats along the inside of it, so that we can kind of shake it, and that hopefully the dirt hits that wood as we shake it. And then there are holes along the side, and then also on the lid as well.
Okay, good. Yeah, that's real important to have lots of holes for aeration, but also on the bottom so the excess water can escape. And yeah, since you have the lid, putting it on the top will also help it, because that'll still let some rainwater and things like that in.
Mark, we have two questions in the chat about grass clippings.
Okay.
They kind of relate. So the first is, should grass clippings be dried before adding to the pile? And if grass is dried before adding, is that considered brown matter?
Good question. And that's one that people a lot of times are very curious about. If you notice under the nitrogen section here, you know, we do have where the you know, it lists fresh grass clippings. So that would be green grass clippings. With your green grass clippings, as you add them though, you don't want to just dump a whole bunch of grass clippings in. You will need to kind of sift them over your pile. And then if you have like some straw or some leaves or something else that you can kind of spread over that, and then add some more of your grass clippings. The problem with grass clippings that people a lot of times run into is they dump a whole bunch of grass clippings in, you know, like if over their whole pile, if you've got like four inches to a foot of grass clippings all at once, well, what happens is that those grass clippings, they compact real well together, and they actually make a solid mat, which then rain can't penetrate, air can't penetrate, and it seals everything under it, and it just makes for kind of a mess. So anytime you add grass clippings, be sure to add something else with them, some brown matter with them. If you have let them dry, that's not as big of an issue, because once they are all dried up, then it's sort of like straw. Okay, you've basically created straw when you've got it well dried, you know, and it's all brown. So if it has all gone brown, then you're using you're in the carbon area then. What has happened inside the grass clippings, each of those little clippings, there has been a chemical process going on as they dry out, and they have lost their nitrogen, and all they have left in them are the amount of carbon that they would normally have. And so the nitrogen has actually leached out of them basically as they dry. So it is correct that fresh green grass clippings are nitrogen and dried grass clippings are carbon. But either way you add it, don't add it in a large clump. Spread it out and kind of sift it out and add something of the other, you know, especially if you're doing green grass clippings, spread some straw or dried leaves or something like that between some layers of grass clippings.
Mark, in the chat, Barbara has asked, is it best to have the compost pile in a full sun area?
Good question. It's actually, originally, or for many years, it was thought that it was to be best in a full sun location, but that is not necessarily true. If it is in full sun, that's okay. But it's actually better if it's in a part sun, part shade area, an area that sometimes gets a little bit of shade. Because if the sun is always beating down on your compost pile, it dries it out faster. It causes solar heat, which is not the same as the chemical reaction heat that we want going on. And so it does different things in your compost pile. You want some sun so that it does help dry the pile, you know, like after a rain, like we had, you know, during the night. But you don't want, you know, so another way to kind of mitigate that is if you have a full sun location, that's fine. What you probably want to do is to keep some brown matter on hand. So we usually keep a couple of straw bales around all the time. And what I'll do is, you know, like during the summer, if I'm throwing some fresh, you know, scraps of vegetables and fruits, etc., out there into the pile, then I'll try to keep that covered with some straw. But straw allows then you know, so that the sun doesn't beat down into the pile as much. It doesn't produce as much heat. It doesn't dry it out as much, that sort of thing. The moisture that's in those, like an apple core or the banana peel, the moisture that's in there is staying in the pile and going into the pile instead of evaporating out. So that is a way that if you do have a full sun location, I would suggest that you cover it with some straw or, and this is another way to use some of your leaves from last year. Some people like to rake up their leaves or mulch up their leaves and then put them in bags, like trash bags. And if you do that, that's fine. And this is a good way you can use those. You can lay a couple of those next to your compost pile and spread a layer of that over fresh scraps that you put into your pile.
I think you may have just answered our next question, Mark, because Aaron in the chat said, what about leaves from last fall that you keep in the bag? Are there any issues there, any possible issues?
The only possible issues would be if something has gotten into them. If an insect has gotten in there and made a nest, or, if there's just lots and lots of some insect inside there that, you may not want to introduce into your compost pile. Now, again, if it's like the roly-polies, those are fine. You can throw those in there. But, if something else, some sort of gnat or, something along those lines has gotten in there, you probably don't want to add that to your compost pile. But for the most part, stuff that you've put in, like leaves you've bagged up, yes, you can still use those. And you can actually just dump some of that into your compost pile at any time as part of your carbon, part of your brown matter that you're adding to your pile.
I had a question, Mark. As somebody who is new to trying composting, we're going to start trying it this year at my house. And you sort of alluded to this in one of the slides, but what are things that absolutely do not belong in a compost pile?
Yeah, very good. Meat, fish, a whole egg, those sorts of things, or anything that is a dairy product like milk, butter, cheese. Don't put those out there.
Okay.
They will decompose, but the problem is, for example, meat takes a long time to decompose, but any of those things, any of those, like the meat and eggs and cheese, dairy products, they draw in rodents and they draw in other bugs that are not something that you want. Now, if you notice on the screen that I have up in the nitrogen column towards the bottom, it mentions eggshells. Now, eggshells are fine. And even, you crack the egg open, put the egg in your pan or whatever to fry. Then just take those eggshells. I would kind of crush them a little bit before you put them in the pile. But other than that, you can just, if you also have a banana peel in there too, you can just kind of wrap that in the banana peel and kind of crush it up some. That amount of egg is fine, but not like, you crack an egg open and it's bad or something. And so you dump that, just throw that away. Don't put a whole egg or cooked eggs even, or anything like that into your compost pile.
Okay, that makes sense. Does anyone else have anything for Mark? Well, thank you all so much for attending this morning. I know I learned a lot. I always appreciate the little sort of presentation at the beginning to cover all the basics. Mark mentioned a handout, and that will be emailed to you here shortly. I did see that come through on my email, Mark, so I will send that out to the email that you registered with. So look for that this afternoon. And Mark, is there anything else you want to add before we sign out for the day?
I think that's pretty good. If you do have other questions about composting, you can always call the Botanical Center or the Master Gardener hotline. And I do not have the hotline number with me right now, but you can, if you call the Springfield Botanical Center, they can get that for you.
All right. Well, everyone have a great weekend. Thank you all for attending, and happy composting. We'll see you later.
Yeah. Thanks.
Bye.